the fact that we are 5 minutes late is premeditated. It's not an accident. It's due to the fact that two of the dignitaries that were invited and gave their consent to address us in the beginning had to cancel. So we have extra time on our hands, so we took the liberty of starting 5 minutes later. These were Professor Nachman Ash, who was called by the Prime Minister, and I had to comply, and Professor Otzion Chagai, who has an important meeting in the Parliament. Again, couldn't say anything about that. But we are fortunate enough that Professor Dina Ben Yehuda, the Dean of the Medical School here in Hadassah Hebrew U, is with us. Before I will invite her to address us, I just would like to say a few words about who we are, what we do, why we are here, and then acknowledge our sponsors, and also say hello to all the friends and colleagues who are on the Zoom with us, with the indefatigable Sabine Hildenbrand. As you know what time it is in Boston, so you can see what a kind of a sacrifice she's doing for us. And Sari in Los Angeles, okay. And, okay. So we have a bunch of committed people, as you can see. The Lancet Commission on Medicine and the Holocaust was launched January 27, 2020, through the vision and leadership of Professor Richard Houghton, the editor-in-chief of the journal. We actually have a representative of the Lancet with us, Miriam Sabin, who is our user-friendly editor. She's following us and guiding us in what we are trying to do. And what is it that we are trying to do? Richard became convinced by a few of us, some of them here in the room or in the Zoom, that it's time to send a message that learning about medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust should be a part and parcel globally wherever health profession education is taking place. Right now it's happening on a small scale, which has grown in the last few years, but it still is not very ubiquitous. And once we will publish our report, hopefully we'll make a difference. We already witnessed the fact that in the last 2 years there is already an increase in the visibility and the presence of this domain again throughout the world. So the launch actually defines 3 goals: to create a history, a based evidence history that will be vetted by top historians who are among us here. The second aim was to try to draw the implications from the history. And the third one is to draft a roadmap how this history and implications can be translated into educational activities. This is what we have been doing in the last 15 months, including the last 3 days that were intensive, emotional roller coaster, and very productive and also somewhat enjoyable in spite of the topic and the venue in which we are. Besides the 20 commissioners that come from 6 countries and represent, as I said, history, clinical medicine, education, and ethics, we have recruited a student advisory board, 16 students or young physicians or young health professionals or health-related scientists that have been elected internationally. 8 of them are here with us. Others are on the Zoom, so we had people from Japan to Los Angeles present in what we were doing, and I hope they will be present here as well. And besides representing the voice of our end users, those who will have to endure the curricula that we are going to promote, they have supplied a very important message to us, which is how to apply the issue in context beyond, the European, North American, Israeli usual contexts that have already presence of the Holocaust and Nazism in high schools, in other educational venues, but what is our message to one of the students in Congo or another in Indonesia? And David was very helpful in putting us in contact with colleagues around the world, and we are very fortunate that we have found this incredible group of young people, and as I said, 8 of them are here in the flesh. We are also very fortunate that we found generous sponsors that made it possible for us to get together from all corners of the world, and let me acknowledge them. First, the Israeli Foundation. They have helped us already 5 years ago when we had an international conference of scholars of the Holocaust in the Galilee, and they were as generous this time. Yad Vashem, of course, the Israel Medical Association, a French foundation called Fondation Shoah that jumped on the wagon in the last few weeks. The Hebrew University through the Berman Center for Jewish and Holocaust Studies, and the Faculty of Medicine, led by Professor Ben Yehuda, that was very instrumental in supporting us. And I don't think I've forgotten anybody. So let's give an applause to our sponsors in recognition of their contribution. And with no further ado, Professor Dina Ben Yehuda, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine in the Hebrew University, Hadassah, please.
I'm second generation of Holocaust survivors who lost their families in Czechoslovakia and Poland. My mother was over 80 years old when she told me that she played many roles in her life, but she always remained the little girl from the Holocaust. I later found a poem by the name, but by that name exactly, The Little Girl from the Holocaust, written by Halina Birenbaum. Like my mother's family, her family were transferred to Auschwitz camp in 1943. I would like to read you the poem. I always see myself as a little girl. The girl inside me feels hopeless. Even as an old woman, I remember her, identifies with her figure. Everything else is distant, forgettable. How great is that internal girl in me who refuses to sink into the shadow of the years and events, who run after me all the way and does not let herself growing up. There is no end to her story. She will never die and never disappear from me, the little big girl from the Holocaust. So in the name of my mother and Halina and many other children who lost their youth in the Holocaust, I would like to thank you and hope that the constant reminder and the research that you are doing will avoid the next Holocaust. Seeing the pictures coming from Ukraine just emphasize it more. So thank you, and I wish you a very interesting day. I'm sorry that I wouldn't be able to stay with you.
Okay. We are still right on time. So I will invite Amir Teicher, Tel Aviv University, Department of History, to introduce our plenary speaker, please.
Good morning. I'm really happy to introduce Professor Havi Dreyfus. She is a colleague, professor in the Department of Jewish History in Tel Aviv University, who works on Polish Jewry during the 20th century leading up to the extermination. She published in Hebrew, in English, and also in Polish. Her work combines, I would say, four things which are quite rare for to have them combined in a scholar, which is a great scholarly depth and width, sharp analytical skills, passion, and compassion. She works both in Tel Aviv University and also here in Vashem as head of institute looking at Polish Jewry and the relations between Jews and Poles, and also religion during the war and before that, and is also active in raising an important academic voice which comes out against threats to academic freedom, especially with regard to the Polish laws trying to politicize what kind of history should or should not be done. So she is a very important voice both academically and publicly. I'm happy to have you here, Havi. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amir, and thank you all for coming here to Yad Vashem. The topic I was asked to address is actually related to two and even three disciplines: Nazism, Holocaust, and the Genocide. Those three fields have specific associations and overlap, but differ in the form they develop, their attention to medical aspects, and their current tenets. Therefore, although I will address each of them separately, I will also try to display their conjunctions and their implication for the research of medical aspects. The first subject of the three that was devoted into a field of research, and the only one in which medicine has occupied a central place from the very beginning, is the study of Nazism and the Third Reich. Indeed, with the end of the Second World War, disciplines in humanities, social sciences, and theology tried to understand how and why Nazi Germany became unprecedentedly murderous. Early as year 1946, the first historical analysis of Nazi terror system was published. There is a start. 1 second, please. Okay. Thank you very much, Amir. Der is a start, written by Eugen Kogan, a former prisoner in Buchenwald, which included a chapter on medical experiments in Nazi camps. Those medical experiments soon became the focus of research, in part following what has been called the German doctor's trial, bringing 23 war criminals before US military courts. In the years 47 till 49, Mitscherlich and Mielke published in German and in English documents submitted to the court, Wissenschaft der ohne Menschlichkeit, or in English, the Death Doctors, and in 1960, their protocols, Medizin ohne Menschlichkeit, Documentes del Nürnberger Arztprozess. The impact of the doctor trials was significant, not only because of the difficult question that arose about how physicians performed acts that seemingly contradict the medical world DNA, and I'm using the word seemingly contradict because, in fact, those physicians often justified their murderous actions in terms of medical ethics. It was also important in the precedents. It was a second trial starting in 46, and in that most of early research about Nazism was based on documentation collected as part of Nazi criminals' persecution. And I'm sorry, I don't know what is going on here. Okay, we'll try to do it again. I'm sorry, this is part of, I'll just continue and Maya will help me here. Including physicians, that most of the early research about Nazism was based on documentation collected as part of Nazi criminals' persecution, including physicians, and in the early 60s, the Britons and the USA allowed access to those archives. True, parallel with this research, testimonies of physicians who were, you can stop here, who were victims of Nazism was also published. And I'm talking here about Historia Jednej by Hirschfeld and the memories of Miklos Nizli in 46, as well as the testimony of Gisela Perl from 1948. Dr. Mark Dvorzetsky, also published preliminary studies on activities of Jewish physicians, and the well-known hunger disease was published in Polish, as well as a study on hunger in camps. But all of this did not leave a mark on the field, which continued to focus on criminal activities of German physicians, especially in camps. The scholarly limitations were due to archival challenges as well as so-called sensitivities. First, it discussed events that occurred shortly before, and some of the participants, I'm talking about perpetrators as well as victims, were still alive. Moreover, conducting research on Nazism during the Cold War had biases and deceptions, including the West's attempt to identify Nazism with communism. That is, the victory of the free world over Nazism and fascism was converted in those years to the struggle of democratics against totalitarian regimes, and various studies, Popper, Talmon, and others, emphasized alongside I'm sorry about the presentation, the differences between those regimes, their similarities. But the most important book in this context is unquestionably Hannah Arendt's book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, published in 1951. Its first part discussed anti-Semitism, while the second was devoted to the imperialism, a concept we'll meet later, as a basis for fascism, and dealt with racism and the decline of nation states, terrorism and bureaucracy as modern tools, and how crimes against humanity became a norm. In this context, it should also be noted that in the Eastern Bloc, people argued that all fascist histories continue to exist in Western countries, and research on that subject tended to erase any ethnic, religious, national identification of its victims, including Jewish victims. Examples could be taken from Shimon Datner's book on the Wehrmacht crimes, including medical crimes committed on POWs, doctors as heroes of the Soviet Union, both from '61, and Soviet medicine during the Great Patriotic War from 1970. However, from the late 60s to the 80s, the study of Nazism occupied two main controversies, and in this context, we could refer to them only shortly. The first focused on the crystallization of the final solution and Hitler's or Nazi ideology in it, I'm talking about the intentionalism and functionalism, and ultimately led to much research on grassroots factors and high-ranking ideological perception on the development of the final solution. The second controversy, the Historiker Streit, dealt with the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Ernst Nolte, who was known for his research on fascism and communism, attacks the extensive interest, in his view, in Nazism over a variety of other crimes, especially communist one. Nolte was attacked by various scholars in the field and was accused for relativization of the Holocaust, as you can see in Katz's essay, but some of those arguments will come up later on the debate about genocide. An examination of the medical aspect in this research literature suggests that those discussions have to some extent diverted attention from this topic. True, even in the 60s and 70s, studies dealing with the crimes of physicians in specific camps, Auschwitz, Gosos, and Mauthausen, continue to be published, alongside testimonies of physicians held as prisoners. And in 75, 4 volumes dealing with murderous doctors was published. Moreover, survivor researchers, as Dvorzetsky mentioned before, and Lansky, also published short articles, usually in medical journalists, in which they discussed a variety of topics such as medical science and medical conscience, heart pathology in ghettos and camps, and Klauber's crimes. In 1979, Winnick republished The Hunger Disease. but the increasing study of medical aspect would be recorded only in the mid-80s with the publication of Nazi doctors and murderous science. In this study, Lifton described the role of physicians in forcible sterilization, killing of children and adults, and in the camps, while addressing healing-killing paradox. And Muller here spoke about the activities of prominent researchers and physicians in international eugenic movements, and the issue of science as supportive of murder will return again in genocide studies, and how they provided the scientific basis for racist policies, including euthanasia and the final solution. In doing so, those essays constituted a clear indictment against the role played by German physicians and scientists in the atrocities of Nazi Germany. Indeed, the 80s were a period in which the discussion of those issues expanded, and in this context I will mention that a few publications as Rassenhygienic, National Socialism and Euthanasia, which refer to the destruction of the so-called unworthy living, Racial Hygiene from 88, Doctors under Hitler from 89, and on the same year, Gates-Alley Research, Der Wert mentioned the value of human being, Medicine in Deutschland, 1918 to 1945. Now, actually, as early as the mid-80s, as part of his research on Julius Hallervorden, who headed the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Brain Research, Alley claimed Hallervorden had received brains of euthanasia victims and that those are still preserved at the Max Planck Institute of Brain Research. It was during this period that questions about activities of a variety of leading research institutions in Germany and Austria during the Third Reich and their part in the extermination and euthanasia and the final solution began to arise, and these phenomena have even expanded in the 19th. However, health institutions traced their charge history only when they were forced to do so. One appealing example, is a case of the Pernkopf Atlas, which I'm sure is well known to this audience. Israel's and Williams' futile attempts as early as the late 80s to confirm that inmates were used in the preparation of the Atlas. Yad Vashem, participant in demanding in 1995 the University of Vienna and Innsbruck to conduct an investigation, a demand that was rejected, and the findings in the late 1990s stating that the Institute of Anatomy received over 1,300 bodies, some shot, some guillotined, including those of children, and that Pernkopf himself had an active role in obtaining those bodies. True, the Nuremberg Law, the Nuremberg Code, and the Declaration of Helsinki were some of the results of the trials mentioned earlier, and the ethical concept of today were unknown back then. And yet, the knowledge of what underlined the esteemed medical atlas had raised ethical questions, educational as well as medical, that are still at our doorstep. How can knowledge based on crimes be used? Indeed, the 1990s, which combined research motivation to examine the world of medicine alongside the opening of the archive in Eastern Europe, led to an actual flow of research in the field. And in this context, I will represent only a few examples: Nazi doctrine and the Nuremberg Law, the origin of Nazi genocide from euthanasia to the final solution, and epidemics and genocide in the Eastern Europe. Even previous decades, only a dozen of studies in the field were published at most. From the 19th, we're talking about hundreds. And as we can see, a variety of aspects have been researched, alongside with continuing the discussion of physician trials, those who performed experiment and their institution. Scholarly interest developed into areas of medical and paramedical knowledge, Jewish and non-Jewish physicians, health policy, as well as eugenists and the role of science in shaping the Nazi world and its crimes. This richness, raised fundamental question in the study of ethics, not only in the sense of Franklin Little from the 70s, but also in the context of medicine as ethical discrimination, medicine and medical ethics in Nazi Germany and blood and homeland. Dealing with eugenics and racial nationalism. In the last years, additional studies have been added, including Amir's book which examines how scientific genetics perceptions have influenced social worldview and translated into racial biological policies, and Verschitt's book, The Metaphysics of Race, which seeks to reconstruct the ideological climate that enabled Nazi Germany create a murderous political culture. Those discussions shows how science, including medical science, became instrumental in shaping and legitimizing murder. The interest in medicine, which began with a limited discussion of the doctor's trial, has expanded and deals today with murderers and victims, thus becoming part of the study of the Holocaust, to which I want to move now. Surprising as it might sound, even as Nazism emerged as a vibrant field of research, the victim perspective in general and the Jewish victims in particular were not a research topic per se. True, already in the war, Jews wrote research, including the medical one, the hunger research, Ringelblum Archive, etc. Still, those writings, impressive as they were most limited, and the writers usually did not survive the Holocaust. With the end of the war, research of Jewish fate resumed, mainly in the framework of the Jewish historical committees. Medicine occupied a small part in their publication. The study of family, for example, was published by the JDC and could have been deepened. However, following the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe and the immigration of the surviving researchers, this initial momentum of research was halted. Researchers who remained in Eastern Europe did publish several medical studies in scientific journals, example from the Bulletin of the Jir. Still, over the years, they too had to adapt to the distorted perception of the war as existed in the Soviet Union. And most immigrant survivor researchers here in Israel and abroad have received a cold soldier from professional historians. True, some of them, physicians as Dvorzetsky, Lansky, and Woolman, wrote preliminary studies on the subject, as we can see here, Methodarium of the Jewish Physicians in Poland. Others, as Trunk and Friedman as an example, incorporated medical aspects into their broader research. But as Boscoin showed, most surviving researchers have failed to integrate into the world's leading academic institutions and were unable to guide students who could continue to deepen the research on the fate of the Jews in the Holocaust, including its medical aspects. Yet those years did not present a complete void, and several journal essays have dealt directly with the Holocaust, as Reitlinger, The Final Solution, and Tenenbaum, Reis, and the Reich. Yet their medical interest was minimal, as Professor Michman has already presented you, and they did not address a genuine focus on the Jewish people. This scattered way of dealing with the Jewish experience during the Holocaust was intensified and even became a principle in Raoul Hilsberg's monumental book, The Destruction of the European Jews. Like other, Hilsberg relied mainly on sources collected by allies and saw Jewish documentation as insignificant for scholarly work. But development that took place in Israel in the 70s and the 80s changed this picture dramatically and made the Holocaust a discipline of worldwide importance. This change must be attributed first and foremost to the integration of Yehuda Bauer and Israel Gutman at the Hebrew University and Yad Vashem, who soon became the address for those interested in the Holocaust. Bauer and Gutman had different perception on some various matters, genocide included, and yet shared a basic principle. The Holocaust and Nazism could not be understood without including the Jewish story. Their research did not deal with what was done to the Jews, but with what the Jews themselves did. And their sources were not only Jewish ones as diaries and testimonies, but also German documentation and accounts written by local population, which soon became the base for extensive research. One example can be taken from Yitzhak Arad's book, which dealt with Operation Reinhard Kampf, discussed the life of the Jewish prisoners, as well as the role of the T4 personnel in those murder facilities, a topic that was received further research by Sarah Berger, Experenten Vernichtung later on. Similarly, Ver's monograph refers to the Jewish physician within a broad context, though they did not occupy a particular central role. This increased study of Jewish life must not be seen only in the Israel context, and it was also influenced by worldwide processes, including the flourishing of Jewish studies, the rise of the Alta Geschichte, and the importance of personal stories in the understanding of the overall historical picture, called by Annette Vivioka, the Age of Witness. Indeed, despite the centrality of Jerusalem Israeli school that flourished in the 70s and 80s, there were also important studies written abroad that dealt with the Jewish life during the Holocaust, as Lucy Davidovich, The War Against the Jews, and Maru Studies, Holocaust in the History, published in 87. Most of those studies addressed medicine in a secondary way, but soon, and here the impact of Nazism research could be seen, studies concentrating on medical issues also started to appear. Some focused on Jewish physicians and their activities, but others were integrated in a broad framework as Courage Under Siege, Medicine and Nazism, and Ofer's book on Jewish medicine in the Warsaw Ghetto. Thus, over the years, scholars and institutions made the story of Jewish life a central part of their work. And the opening of the archive in the East in the 90s, as well as the attempt of European countries, and not only Germany, to face their past, both mentioned before, contributed to this trend. Yet while Jewish life during the Holocaust became a worldwide topic, here in Israel, many became more interested in the survivors, Sherit HaPleta, the Israeli society and the Holocaust, and memory and commemoration, as Herzog's book about the medical staff in Israel. And still, the Holocaust was established as a global phenomenon and demonstrated the importance of writing about those years while giving a central weight to the victims and their stories. A clear example, a clear expression of this trend can be found in the monumental book of Shaul Friedlander, Nazi Germany and the Jews, in which the voices of the Jews as a vibrant public is an integral part of history. Now, to what extent do the medical aspects appear in this and other comprehensive studies, as Dickman's book about Lithuania, Yad Vashem series of the Holocaust history, and others? In this context, I will not be able to analyze this in depth. We will still need to get to genocide, but I will generally say that the world of knowledge, as shaped in the study of Nazism and Holocaust, usually found its way to them. Another thing we should say that analyzing those publications emphasizes the physician part in the writing of those topics, and here I'll just mention the late Professor Shasha and his contribution to the field. Still, one of the most stimulating studies that belonged to Holocaust research in some extent and has not yet been mentioned was written by a sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, Modernity and the Holocaust, which was first published in 1989. Contrary to the notion that the Holocaust expressed a retreat from modernity, Bauman argued that it was closely related to it and claimed that extermination camps, as well as medical experience, eugenic, euthanasia, and bureaucracy, are all part of modernity. Bauman depicted the logic of modern murderous bureaucrats, arguing that the Nazi order was based in part on science, including medical science. According to him, in the face of the Jewish unclarity, Jews could be socialists and capitalists and so on, Nazism placed clear scientific definitions of race. But as I have hinted, it is difficult to place this study only in the Holocaust field, and it might be seen as presented to the third framework to which I was asked to refer, genocide studies. Genocide studies refer to a wide range of concepts, including ethnic cleansing, mass violence, crimes against humanity, and more. But ultimately, it is based on Lemkin's 1944 genocide definition, even if the research itself challenged the definition, as we will see soon. As a result, this field also grew out of legal world, but developed differently from Nazism and has gained revival mainly in the last 20 years. True, one can find studies that have dealt with various cases of genocide even before that, some with explicit mention of the term, the history and the sociology of the genocide, or the revolution of genocide referring to Armenia. Moreover, Arendt, in her book, The Roots of Totalitarianism, has touched on how racist and colonialist views influenced Nazi Germany murders. And in the early 19th, one can find initial references linking the Holocaust and genocide, as Henry Friedlander's books mentioned before. Still, in this period, this field was characterized by social science, especially political science. Most studies focused on one case, and many of the scholars were motivated by the desire to prevent future genocide, as in this book, its political use in the 20th century. However, the 1990s, including the genocide in Bosnia and Rwanda, sharpened existing legal definition and encouraged historians to discuss these murder phenomenons. In this context, various researchers began to examine, similar to the process of the final solution, the complex system of murder decision-making in various cases of genocide. For example, Ben Kirman and Pol Pot regime, and Donald Blocksom, The Great Game of Genocide, Imperialism, Nationalism, and the Destruction of the Ottoman Armenians. Those works enhanced the understanding of the need for comparative studies and promoted attempts to create a comprehensive conception of genocide, assembling, purify, and destroy the political use of massacre and genocide. Although the Holocaust was already perceived at this stage as challenging to compare due to its wide geographical range and multiple murder patterns, shooting pits, extermination camps, and so on, those studies indicated that in other cases of genocide too, there was a clear intention of mass destruction. And I'm talking about Armenians, Cambodia, Rwanda, and so on. However, the historical preoccupation of genocide did not consider itself bound by the legal definition, including state violence and existence of intent, and began analyzing murders that lacked intention and clear extermination orders, exploring cases of colonialism with its positive, patronizing attitude toward natives. This gave power to the concept of colonialist genocide related mainly to America, Spanish America, and Africa. This concept reappeared within the field of the Holocaust, trying to apply it mainly to the Nazi occupation in the East. For example, Blocksom argued in his book, The Final Solution, that just as other colonialist cases, Eastern Europe was perceived as a space to be exploited until the disappearance of the uncultured natives. And Robert Gelatelli and Bel Kirman connected between the intellectuals who supported the Nazi and those who held imperialistic views in Africa. Furthermore, some scholars have attempted to locate German physicians who addressed its view regarding colonialism and were involved in the murder of the Jews. Dr. under Hitler had a few examples. And Zimmermeer linked the president of the murdering of the Herero and the Nazi success in recruiting bureaucracy and armed forces to the murder of the Jews. In this context, I should add that diseases were ultimately limited as a genocidal tool, primarily due to the similar human biology of victims and victimizers. However, disease and hygiene have been used as the justification for segregation in genocide case, and in this sense, physicians and their language was sometimes a leading force. For example, Nightingale, in his book Segregation, A Global History of Divided Cities, shows how in various cases the support of intellectuals, including theorists of race, physicians, jurists, and others, not only supported the idea of segregation, but also provided practical ideas. Thus, placing Holocaust research within the broad context, including racial hygiene, mass violence, and more, can raise interesting questions and important insight. In the terms of the current state of genocide studies, according to Dan Stone, an historian of the Holocaust, fascism, and genocide, there are two main trends: the study of nationalism and the study of imperialism and colonialism. According to Levine, Mark Levine, who is maybe one of the main factors in this nationalism approach, as part of the genocide, nation states with minorities promote national goals while differentiating some of their own citizens. On the other hand, Dirk Moses focused on colonialism and imperialism and argued that Nazi campaign against the Jews should not be seen as a colonial genocide, but in a reversal move I don't really understand, I must admit, as a kind of a German murderer self-defense against what they perceived as a colonization by the Jews. In his even newer book, The Problems of Genocide, Moses moved one step forward and claimed that the concept of genocide, approved and even created by Western violence by making the Holocaust a standard for the ultimate crime. Omer Bartov, a scholar of Nazism, Holocaust, and genocide, argues in a debate published in Frankfurter Allgemeiner Zeitung that by this Moses exposed a problematic aspect in some of the works focusing on genocide, one that sees the Holocaust as an obstacle to genocide studies and actually delegitimize this research. As a historian of the Holocaust, I must admit I struggle with many of the positions expressed by some genocide researchers. Neither the concept of genocide bothers me, nor the comparative aspect, which is so vital for historians as other scholars. And just one example is the latest research in Holocaust studies about sexual violence, which was not researched in the past. In the same manner, widening the chronological and geographical aspect provide fascinating discussion of murderous violence before and after the Holocaust. And in fact, Holocaust scholars working in Eastern Europe, about Eastern Europe, as Wendy Lauer and Christopher Browning, refer to Nazi aspiration to build Eastern Europe as a colonial empire, similar to that of other European nations. And just as a reminder, I will say that the German colonialism was relatively short compared to its neighbors. It was only from the 1880s to 1919, and pointed to the parallel tools used against the Slavic people, including looting, enslavement, and murder. Moreover, alongside those discussions, Holocaust scholars as Bauer and Michman debate on Holocaust genocide issues too. In other words, it is not the concept of genocide that is challenging Holocaust scholars, but what some researchers have made of it, enforcing it as the only context in which global catastrophe can be discussed, while rejecting analyzing the Holocaust, an event that was rooted in its very definition. For me, and for many of my colleagues, whether they define themselves as historians of the Holocaust, of Nazism, of genocide, or of a variety of other fields we have not approached yet, all of those disciplines are essential. They not only complement each other, but also overlap and sometimes even confront each other. For example, we haven't addressed yet the relationship between those fields. Is the Holocaust one episode out of many, or the event that defines Nazism or genocide? As always, a balanced approach is important. The Holocaust could not be identified with Nazism or genocide, not only because of other victims, European or global ones, but because of the reduction it will pose on Holocaust studies themselves. On the other hand, comparing the final solution to other crimes which took place during the Holocaust, Nazism, or in other periods as genocide, do not mean equalizing them, and mainly emphasize some fundamental differences between them. As historians, we are concentrating on the past, hoping our knowledge and understandings could help to shape a better world. As other scholars, we are failing on a daily basis. Even in cases, such as the contemporary one from the Ukraine, in which Nazism and the Holocaust are presented as a myth, and of course it is a myth, drawing practical conclusion is challenging. I know you do not need me to remind you that Germany was, prior to the 30s, at the forefront of research, and that its action demonstrate, among other things, that progress does not necessarily lead to humanity. But the study, the careful study of the numerous choices taken in those years can also indicate that good people do evil deeds in the time of crisis, and that oaths, even Hippocratic oaths, do not prevent murder. Those years also suggest that societies change slowly, for better or for worse, and that minor human betrayal that lead to moral collapse are much more common and thus much more dangerous than major ones. You know the medical myth better than I do, as well as what happens to the value of human lives in tortured societies. For this reason, the challenges you face as members of the Lancet Commission will impact all of us, not only in exposing the relevant historical evidence upon what was shown here and many other research, but mainly in wisely implementing it in our world. Thank you very much.
We can take questions.
Thank you for the very thorough. I was just thinking how to copy-paste all the books in the presentation.
Yeah, well, that was a challenge.
Business. Of course, there are even some people here in the crowd that maybe were not there somewhere. So, like Professor Volker Renke and Professor Seidemann, but I think that one major component that I'd like to reflect and to be also in our presentation is the question of eugenics, that I think is crucial. And in general, the other sub-disciplines, probably the most important one is history of medicine and public health. It's a whole huge world that unfortunately many times it's not so much in discussion with many of the people that you described. Of course, I think Miriam and here with us, and some others at the end that are very aware of it. I wonder, as someone who's coming from a certain disciplinary context, how much you are engaged with the history of eugenics.
Okay, so first of all, I must admit that choosing what to present here, knowing this very important crowd, was quite demanding, and I'm sure I made some mistakes. But I didn't want it to be just a bibliography reading list. And there are certainly among the people sitting here, as well as other cases which I just couldn't present, and I apologize for that. But what I wanted to show is general tendencies, and of course you're right that eugenics is a very important part of it. It is a topic that was tackled quite earlier than public health, which we only in the later years, at least in Holocaust studies in Nazism, are referring to. And I must admit that there are other topics which I didn't refer here. For example, the Red Cross and other organizations, and the part of organizations in trying to promote or promote preventing those things or actually supporting them. So eugenics, I will say, is of course very, very important, and I will say the following. One of the questions I was asking myself is, with all this knowledge of about medical aspects, what is being put in Holocaust studies? Eugenics is one of the things that for sure will appear in those things. Public health, not as much yet, but it could be that when we'll have more research about the topic, we'll be able to have this incorporated as well. For that, so
No, it's like giving us the floor. But we're going to discuss a lot of public health.
this was one. No, but this was one. We of course discussed it before. I'm joking, but what I'm trying to say is that you can see that it takes time for specific research on medical topics, just as any other topics. It could be about legal things and so on, to penetrate to the general narrative of Holocaust. Eugenic studies is already there. Public health, I'm not sure at the same part. And when I'm saying it, I told Amir before that we are writing here at Yad Vashem now as a group of 6 scholars, the history of the Holocaust in Poland. And I was asking myself what of this knowledge will be part of our group. I don't think we'll have a chapter on the medical aspect in the Holocaust in Poland, but we will have, of course, reference to ideology, to those scientists, to T4. Eugenics will be, I guess, mentioned in this way or other. Jewish doctors and their approach and other things. So it won't be as a topic, but it takes time to penetrate in the general research. So I'll be more than happy to hear your presentation.
Anybody? Also our Zoom participants, raise a hand if you wish to pose a question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we move to our first session, we are going to have actually 2 sessions. Now that we have a few minutes, first of all, I want to acknowledge the fact that I think representatives of at least 5 medical schools are here in the audience. I think except Ariel, we have all 5 represented with a very strong delegation from Beersheba. Welcome. Also, I think it's a moment in which we can say a few thank you. I want to start first and foremost by saying thank you to Shani, who is also from Beersheba. A 6-year medical student that is our administrative assistant, but actually she runs the show of the commission, and she took care of all of us in a very compassionate and effective way the last few days. So thank you, Shani. I also, for those who weren't with us yesterday night, want to acknowledge the following inspirations. First, Dr. Bill Seidelman, who is actually the forefather of the commission and a mentor to almost all of us in the field of medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust, who yesterday mentioned, but I think it's appropriate to mention again, two of our late predecessors. First, Dr. Tommy Spencer, the late Dr. Tommy Spencer, who was my personal mentor in family medicine, but also the one that launched the Medicine and the Holocaust program in Haifa, and actually was very instrumental in the early years of our movement, and Professor Shaul Shasha, whose daughter Hadassah is with us, the late Professor Shasha, who actually made a very concrete presence of the issue by the yearly conference in Nahariya and his research, and Hadassah is actually continuing in his footsteps, and she's now with Miriam running an elective course in Safed Medical School on the domain, and we are very grateful to Shaul and to Tommy, and I think it was important that we will remember them here and acknowledge their contribution.